Good day. 2 days ago, Russia launched what is now universally acknowledged to have been the biggest single missile attack on Ukraine in a single day. The British Ministry of Defence claims that up to 90 missiles, Russian missiles, were launched at Ukraine over the course of that day. Today, we hear that there's another massive missile attack underway. We don't yet know its full scale, but it seems to be similar in dimensions to the one that was launched 2 days ago. In other words, the Russians are mopping up, presumably, on whatever targets were left over from their attack of 2 days ago, and we're getting a sense that this missile offensive is going to continue in one form or another. Well, in fact, in this particular form of the Russians launching massive missile strikes over the course of several days, and waiting and seeing what the Ukrainians do. When the Ukrainians try and fix their system, launching another series of comparably vast missile strikes, and that now looks like being the regular pattern for as long as this conflict continues. Again, as I did the other day, I'm going to wait until the missile launches, the missile strikes, the pattern of missile strikes has become clear, and we'll discuss this in more detail in my next program. Meanwhile, the previous missile strike has provided Russia with a completely unexpected bonus. Now, yesterday I discussed at some length the story of the S-300 air defense missile, the indisputably Ukrainian S-300 air defense missile, which landed in Poland and which tragically killed 2 people. I also spoke about the extraordinary behavior of the media, at least especially in Britain, which to a degree that, frankly, I still find shocking, spent the hours before the confirmation that it was a Ukrainian missile, pretending that it was Russian, and giving us absolutely lurid headlines, setting out how this was a Russian attack on a NATO member state. Now, a lot has happened since that time. For one thing, we now know that that missile was Ukrainian. And yesterday, in my video, I suggested that it was probably a stray missile, a missile that Ukraine launched in order to try to intercept one of those 90-plus Russian cruise missiles that were pouring into Ukraine over the course of yesterday, the day before yesterday, and that this was probably the explanation for it, that the missile was launched, the Ukrainian S-300 missile was launched, that it missed its target, and as these S-300 missiles have a habit of doing, it fell to earth, in this case, tragically, upon 2 people in Poland. Well, that seemed to me a sufficient explanation. Ukraine could have accepted that, taken it and apologized to Poland, perhaps offered to pay compensation. And I think that would have been the last we would have heard of the whole affair. That was what I was expecting. But bizarrely, it's not what the Ukrainians have done. And they've acted in the most strange and counterproductive way. But firstly, let's just recap on some of the facts about this particular incident. Not the facts of the incident itself. I think these are now well established, that this was a Ukrainian missile which landed in Poland. But let's talk about the coverage of the facts. There was, when the news first arose of missiles landing in Poland, there was an article which appeared in Associated Press. Now, this article claimed to be based on information provided by a very senior US administration official. As always, we're never told the identity of this person. We cannot even be absolutely certain that this person exists. Though I have to say that a news agency like Associated Press, I can't seriously believe that they would publish something saying that it had come from a senior administration official if it did not come from a senior administration official. I have repeatedly spoken out about this practice of senior members of the US government speaking to the media in this kind of way. It is deeply manipulative. It lends credence to unconfirmed stories. It gives them the apparent stamp of authority, whereas, of course, the official who makes these claims can hide behind a cover of anonymity, and if the story then turns out to be untrue, as in this case, that person, whoever he or she is able to simply walk away and then come back and do the same thing all over again. It is, in my opinion, the worst form of journalism. I think that the Western media, the American media especially, has become far too close to these anonymous officials, and they should absolutely refuse to accept what these anonymous officials say, except when they are prepared to come forward and speak on the record, which of course this person wasn't prepared to do in this case. Anyway, this anonymous official apparently told Associated Press that it was Russian missiles attacking Poland. And that story was wrong. And Associated Press ran with that story, and it was picked up by most of the media. The British media articles that I've been talking about basically based their lurid, grotesque descriptions of the supposed Russian missile attack on Poland largely on the basis of this Associated Press story. And can I say that it's a reasonable presumption that the senior administration official and the Associated Press would have known when that story appeared that it would have the effect in the Western media which it did. So we have that extraordinary story, the assertion that this was a Russian attack, apparently a deliberate Russian attack on Poland. And then a short time passed, and we got pictures, photographs of the wreckage of the missile. And as I've said previously, it was quickly and easily identified by large numbers of experts in Russia, but also in the West, as an S-300 air defense missile, one of the older generation of these missiles, and the entire story that this was a Russian attack on Poland essentially collapsed. And then a short time later, we got a tweet from no less a person than the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba. And he incredibly doubled down on the story that it was a Russian missile. And he started saying that there was a Russian conspiracy theory, as he referred to it, being spread that this missile was in fact Ukrainian and it was an air defense missile from Ukraine, whereas in fact and in reality the missile was Russian. And well, that was Kuleba. He's a rather fiery character. But the hours went on and Ukraine doubled down on that story. And as of this time of making this video, they're continuing to insist that it was in fact a Russian missile and that it was not a Ukrainian missile. They've not really, as far as I can see, provided explanation of what the photographs which are coming out of Poland, showing unequivocally the wreckage of an S-300 missile. They're not explaining or providing an explanation of why those pictures are, in that case, presumably wrong. But they are insisting, and they are acting in an increasingly shrill and angry way in their insistence that this was not one of their missiles, but one of Russia's missiles. And Western governments are apparently beginning to become exasperated by this. And there's been an interesting article in the Financial Times which has a Western official actually straightforwardly accusing the Ukrainians of lying. It's about the first time I've ever seen that happen, by the way. And asking the rhetorical question of why are the Ukrainians persisting in this and destroying trust in this way? Well, the Russians have provided their own explanation, and Vasily Nebenzia, who is the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, has claimed that this whole thing was in fact a provocation. It was an attempted false flag, that's what Nebenzia says, cooked up between Poland and Ukraine, and that it fell apart when the photographs of the S-300 appeared, and when it also became increasingly clear that other NATO countries, including the United States, were not willing to allow themselves to be drawn into this false story. And what Nebenzia is alleging is that this whole affair was cooked up by the Poles and the Ukrainians in order to involve NATO in some way in the conflict in Ukraine, that there's no real Ukrainian response to these vast missile attacks, these huge Russian missile offensives. So presumably in desperation, the Ukrainians are looking around, trying to find some means to entangle the Western powers in the conflict in Ukraine itself, and together with their Polish friends, and presumably their friends in Washington, that senior administration official who gave that story to the Associated Press, a story which, by the way, the Associated Press has now corrected. But this is all an attempt to try to create some kind of story of a Russian missile attack on Poland, on a NATO member state, in order to involve NATO in the conflict in Ukraine. Well, that's Nebenzia's story, and I've no doubt at all that it's a position that the Russians are actively promoting. And to be frank, there are elements of this affair which appear to lend some credence to that theory. We've had extraordinary comments from the Polish president. The Polish president came on national television. He continued to refer to the missile as Russian-made, and he admitted that this was almost certainly some kind of an accident and all of that. He was clearly in retreat from the initial position that it was a Russian missile that deliberately struck Poland. He was retreating from that position, but he was still sort of insinuating in some kind of a way that it was the Russians who were responsible. And one can't help but think that the Poles have been caught in a difficult position. They've been vocal, they've been outspoken in their support for Ukraine over the last couple of months since the conflict began. They refuse to accept that Ukraine can do any wrong. That's the official position of the Polish government. And here they now have a Ukrainian missile killing 2 Polish citizens. Notably, no Polish citizen has yet died in Poland as a result of any Russian military action. but 2 Polish citizens have now died as a result of an Ukrainian military action. So it's not perhaps surprising, given the intensity of this particular Polish government's investment in Ukraine, in supporting Ukraine, that they're very reluctant to walk away and point the finger clearly at Ukraine and say that this was a Ukrainian missile. In fact, the Poles and the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who accepts that it was a Ukrainian missile, all of NATO in aggregate, Prime Minister Sunak of Britain, other NATO leaders, the United States, are all saying, well, it might have been a Ukrainian missile, but ultimately Russia's to blame because, well, the Russians are conducting this conflict. So that's the line that they've all fallen back on. But anyway, the fact is that this extraordinarily evasive address that the Polish president gave, to be completely frank, it could be argued that it might lend some credence to Nebenzia's claims that this was all a false flag operation cooked up by the Poles and the Ukrainians and their friends in Washington, which went wrong. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I don't actually think that is true. I think that the Polish government is many things. It's not a government I have much time for, but I don't believe that it would stage an incident in which 2 Polish citizens were killed. And I don't think that the Ukrainians are reckless enough to send missiles into Poland, killing Polish citizens as part of some kind of false flag operation. I think that Nebenzia is reaping the rewards from this affair, from Ukraine's continuing denials, and by the way, from the Polish president's extraordinary evasive comments, and that those bizarre words by the anonymous American official to Associated Press. But I don't happen myself to think that this was an attempted false flag. I think most probably the simplest explanation is the right one. This was a missile Ukraine launched to try to intercept a Russian cruise missile. It missed and it landed by inadvertently in Poland, where it tragically killed 2 people. Now, some people, like the mayor of Lublin, which is an important town in Poland, have asked how it could happen that a Ukrainian missile, which was intercepting Russian missiles that were launched from the east, how that missile also could have moved eastwards into Poland. I don't think this is a particularly difficult thing to explain. Ukraine's air defense systems will have been located all across Ukraine, and it's not surprising that missiles were launched from different directions to try to intercept Russian cruise missiles as they were passing overhead. I would not find it difficult to imagine that a Ukrainian missile was launched in an eastward direction to try and intercept a Russian cruise missile that had passed eastwards, that it missed and then flew on and struck Poland. I mean, I'm not an expert in these things, but to me, this doesn't seem to be a major issue. But anyway, that's my explanation for it. That's the most plausible explanation that I can see. I should say that I have followed these Russian missile attacks on Ukraine ever since they started to be launched in a serious way back in March. And of course, they've escalated massively since October. And there's been a recurring pattern of Ukraine launching S-300 missiles to try to intercept some of these Russian cruise missiles, the S-300 missiles missing and then landing back to Earth and causing serious damage there, often to civilian buildings, to residential buildings, which the Ukrainians then try to pass off as the result of the Russian attacks. And this is what I believe happened on this occasion. But the Ukrainians persist in arguing otherwise. And I'm going to simply make a few very simple observations. If the Ukrainians are prepared to lie about something like this, where, to be straightforward about it, they've been caught red-handed. I mean, this is a Ukrainian missile. I don't think anybody has any doubt about this. But if they're prepared to lie about something like this, what else have they been lying about? It seems to me that Ukraine's behavior is that of the serial liar, the compulsive liar, who tells lies all the time, has become very accustomed to the fact that the Western sponsors cover for these lies, and is now genuinely outraged, furious, that for some inexplicable reason, as it must seem to the Ukrainians, the Western powers are no longer covering for Ukraine's lies on this in relation to this specific incident. And I think this is the explanation of this affair. But I come back to this. The Western media bases practically its entire account of what goes on in Ukraine, of what's been going on in this conflict, based on what the Ukrainians are saying. The Ukrainians have been making allegations after allegations, going all the way back to 2014. They made allegations, by the way, relating to the shooting down of a particular airline. I'm not going to go there, by the way, but we all know what I'm talking about. And they've made allegations on multiple issues since then. They made allegations about events in a certain northern suburb of Kiev. They've made allegations of a similar nature in Kharkiv. They're apparently busy trying to put together similar allegations elsewhere in Kherson region. They've made allegations about many things, and they've made allegations about war, about fighting. They've admitted at times that sometimes what they've said isn't true. They've admitted, for example, that the ghost of Kiev was a fantasy. They said things which were not true about the heroic defense of Snakes Island right at the start of the conflict, about these border guards, Ukrainian border guards, who defended Snakes Island and went on fighting to the last man, except it turned out that they'd in fact all surrendered. And yet, incredibly, Ukraine persists in that story and has even published stamps about it. So, given that this is so, and given that we now have a brazen example of Ukraine lying, why continue to assume that anything Ukraine says about this conflict is true? Now, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. Saying that what Ukraine says very often is not true, saying that Ukrainians can lie about this conflict, does not mean that the other side always tells the truth. It doesn't mean that the Russians never lie about the conflict and about the things they do, and nobody should be foolish enough to think that. But the pattern that the Western media has been following since the start of the war, and not just the Western media, Western governments, is that the Russians always lie and the Ukrainians always tell the truth. Well, we now see a particularly embarrassing moment when the proof is the opposite. Now, I'm going to finish this little lecture, if you like, on one other thing, which is I spoke earlier about the fact that I think it is absolutely wrong and inappropriate for Western media to just reproduce claims made by anonymous administration, senior anonymous administration officials. I think that this ought to provide a clear-cut example. I don't know what is now passing between Associated Press and the anonymous official who spun them that story about Russia deliberately attacking Poland. I can't help but think that probably there's been no consequences at all. But that official was providing information which was greater than the official knew, and did so in a way that if it had been accepted and if it had become acknowledged, well, that could have potentially severely escalated the conflict. It could have created major tensions between Russia and the West over Ukraine. And we're perhaps fortunate that on this occasion that didn't happen. But as I said previously, that appears to have been this official's intentions. Now, I've discussed how recently the United States appears to be trying to reopen some kind of dialogue with the Russians, some kind of diplomatic initiative apparently is being attempted. I've discussed this in multiple videos. I'm not going to go over that now, but I've also said that clearly there are hardliners in Washington who want to wreck any possibility of a diplomatic compromise. And I can't help but think that we've just seen an example of an official coming out and telling Associated Press more than that official knew, with the intention of escalating tensions between Russia and the West and wrecking any prospects of a diplomatic settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, and of the media in the United States essentially colluding in that enterprise. What prospect can there be for peace when this sort of thing happens? What prospect can there be for trust between the great powers when political leaders, senior members of the American administration behave in that kind of way? And that brings me on to the next incident that I want to discuss today, which is an incident which took place at the G20. To my mind, it was far and away the most interesting incident that took place at the G20. And this was an extraordinary and unprecedented altercation between the President of China, Xi Jinping, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada. Now, I should say that Xi Jinping is someone who is known to be extremely disciplined in the way that he conducts himself in meetings. He is apparently a polite man, but on this occasion, he made no attempt to conceal his anger in this impromptu meeting he had with Trudeau. Now, this came after apparent attempts by Trudeau to arrange a formal one-to-one meeting between himself and Xi Jinping at the G20 summit, and Xi Jinping appears to have refused. Anyway, this meeting was an impromptu one. Not entirely clear to me what happened, but my impression is that Trudeau came wandering up to Xi Jinping and tried to engage Xi Jinping in conversation. Now, I'm sure lots of you have seen the video one particular point about the video that I do want to make is that Xi Jinping spoke always in Chinese, in Mandarin, but I got the clear impression that he could understand a lot of what Justin Trudeau was saying in English, which suggests that Xi Jinping at least has some knowledge of English, which is an important fact that I wasn't aware of, but which I think we can quietly note away. Anyway, the point was that Xi Jinping made it absolutely clear that he was not at all impressed with the way in which Trudeau conducts meetings. He complained to Trudeau that the details of a meeting between Xi Jinping and Trudeau had been provided almost in their entirety to the media, and Xi Jinping also complained that the details that were provided gave a very distorted impression of the conversation that took place between Trudeau and Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping made it absolutely clear that he was deeply unimpressed by this kind of behavior. He thought this was a major breach of protocol, a major breach of trust, and he made it clear that in order for there to be any possible prospect of any successful negotiations between leaders, there has to be trust. And Trudeau, who looked frankly shaken by Xi Jinping's comments, which must have been unexpected, he did what I'm sorry to say Trudeau always does. He retreated into cliches. He spoke about the fact that Canadians always expect straightforwardness and openness and that kind of thing. And of course, Xi Jinping looked, it seemed to me, even more angry. And he said that, if you want an honest and open dialogue, then you have to establish the conditions. In other words, you must preserve confidentiality on that which the other side tells you in these private discussions between leaders which take place. And then Xi Jinping shook Trudeau's hand in a way that looked like a gesture of dismissal and simply walked off. And Trudeau himself then wandered off looking, it seemed to me, rather forlorn and at a loss. Anyway, this is what Xi Jinping is complaining about is in fact part of this same pattern of Western behavior that we see with senior administration officials briefing anonymously the Western media in order to slant news. It's clear that what Xi Jinping was angry about was that Trudeau was leaking stories about what he'd said to Xi Jinping to the Canadian media in order to improve his image in Canada and give himself leverage against the Chinese. And this goes on all the time, I would add. Vladimir Putin recently complained in a press conference in Russia that he'd had what he believed to be a private telephone conversation with Emmanuel Macron, only he subsequently discovered that Macron, whilst speaking to Vladimir Putin over the phone and without disclosing the fact to Putin, had various members of the French media with him as he was talking to Putin over the phone. So that the media, the French media, was in effect listening in to the entire conversation. And Putin made it clear that he knew nothing about this and that he'd not been asked in advance whether he would agree to this. And then when he was asked by a Russian journalist whether this would meant that he would never speak to Macron again, Putin said no, he would speak to Macron, but in future he would assume that the media was present, the French media was present over the course of the conversation, just as it was over the course of this particular conversation that Putin had with Macron. In other words, Putin no longer trusts Macron to keep discussions between himself and Putin to himself, and Xi Jinping no longer trusts Trudeau to keep discussions between himself and Xi Jinping to himself. And this practice of US officials, senior US officials, treating the media as part, an arm of their governments, destroys trust, because it means that the other side, the Chinese and the Russians, and indeed other countries, now know that any communication they have with Western leaders can be distorted, manipulated, used in propaganda terms, and that any event that happens can be manipulated by Western officials via the media and used in propaganda terms. The Russians read all these anonymous reports from officials in the media, and the effect, that the cumulative effect which all of this must have on destroying trust between the great powers simply cannot be overstated. Well, there we go. So a very instructive 24 hours, one which gives us a great insight into the way in which Western governments behave, in which the way in which the Ukrainians are prepared to lie, the way in which the media is prepared to be used by Western governments, and about the collapse of trust between the great powers, something which is extremely dangerous for the world going forward. Anyway, what other things have been going on? Well, there's been a great deal of fighting in Zaporozhye region and in Ugledar in Ukraine. I'm not fully up to date with all the details. The Russians still talk about a possible Ukrainian offensive from Zaporozhye, but they say that they not only expect to repel that offensive, they expect, when the offensive comes, to be able to repel it and then go on the counterattack. And there's even some reports that they've been engaging in spoiler attacks in and around Zaporozhye. And yesterday, an official of the Donetsk People's Republic said that the Russians are now steadily grinding down Ukrainian resistance in Ugledar, and that a fairly formidable Ukrainian force had been built up at Ugledar, perhaps in support of this pending offensive towards Zaporozhye, but that this force, this Ukrainian force, has been steadily whittled down. If it's true, by the way, as the Russians claimed a few days ago, that 1,400 Ukrainian troops had been killed over the course of the Battle of Pavlovka, well, that really does point to a significant Ukrainian build-up in Ugledar, and supports the claims by the Donetsk official that the Ukrainians are being ground down in Ugledar. Anyway, so lots of fighting going on there, and apparently lots more fighting going on in Bakhmut city. There's been more reports now that General Milley believes that Ukraine has reached the limit of what it can realistically hope to do, and that he doesn't believe that Ukraine has any realistic chance of winning any further significant ground over the next few months. Another factor that may be of concern to General Milley is that I've read a rather interesting report recently about the extent of the depletion of Western arsenals, and it's specifically about the depletion of 155mm ammunition in Western arsenals. And this article, which I should say I read on a Russian channel, but it seemed a fairly reliable article, and it looked at existing stocks of 155mm ammunition and new orders that have been placed by the United States for 155mm ammunition. And it suggested that if fighting continues at the current level of intensity, then the United States will be entirely out of 155mm ammunition for its own armed forces by the second half of 2025. Well, that's 2 years away, but this same article suggested that the United States would never allow its stocks of ammunition to fall that low, and it guesstimated that the point would be reached when the United States is would no longer be willing to supply 155mm ammunition to Ukraine. That point would be reached sometime between July and November of next year. Now, that, of course, is fairly consistent with the analysis that Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has been making, that in fact the Western powers are now struggling to keep up with Ukraine's demands for weapons, ammunition. And of course the Ukrainians are now adding to those demands because they've demanded air defense systems, an area in which the West historically is weak and perhaps can't provide very much. But Ukraine is now pleading that these Russian missile attacks are destroying its energy system, its transport system, that Ukraine cannot repair them, that it is desperately short of spare parts, and it's now pleading with the West to provide spare parts. Now, this is, of course, going to be a challenge because the Ukrainian energy and rail systems are of Soviet origin, and the West doesn't produce Soviet-era spare parts. It's possible that some of the East European states do, but I am going to make a guess, actually, that nearly all of those spare parts are actually made in Russia itself. I suspect that even during the period of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and the Comecon, the East European Soviet-led trading bloc, the Soviets probably supplied most of the spare parts to the East European energy systems that did rely on Soviet patterns and Soviet equipment. So it may be that the West doesn't have many spare parts of that nature to supply. And besides, what's the point of supplying spare parts if you carry out repairs only for the Russians to launch another rain of missiles and drones on the various facilities, causing more damage to the system and gradually pushing the system, the Ukrainian energy and transport systems, further towards collapse. And I am going to say something else. A couple of months ago, Putin spoke about the fact that the Russians hadn't even got properly started in Ukraine yet. And I think that's probably true, by the way. I think that, as I've said previously, the major offensive will come when all those 300,000 reservists have been fully inducted into the Russian military and when the Russian build-up is completed. But I've also said that I think it is highly likely that at some point the Russians will attack the bridges as well, the bridges across the Dnieper with their hypersonic missiles. And again, what will the West do should that happen? I don't really see that there's any very obvious solution at that point. The West could provide bridging equipment, but this would nowhere near satisfy the needs the Ukraine would have if it lost the Dnieper bridges. And of course, any pontoon bridges built over the Dnieper would themselves no doubt become targets. So one can start to understand why General Milley may be beating the corridors in Washington and telling people, look, we've gone as far as with this as we can. We're, before very long, going to have serious supply shortages of our own. We're going to deplete our stocks to the point where it's no longer practical to keep on supplying Ukraine with systems. Ukraine's economy is careering towards a crash, and the Russian build-up is coming. What Colonel Douglas Macgregor has talked about when he speaks about the fact that we're now in the calm before the storm. Though I have to say, if you're living in Ukraine at the moment and you have dozens of cruise missiles, Russian cruise missiles raining down upon you, it can't seem as if the calm is particularly calm. But anyway, that's, I suspect, one reason, probably the main reason, why General Milley is making all of those pleas for negotiations at this time. And it would be a tragedy if this is not listened to, if this time, again, the West makes the mistake, the Ukrainians make the mistake of digging in their heels. But given the extent, the behavior of Ukraine over this S-300 missile system in Poland, given General Zaluzhny's outright rejection of negotiations, is it realistic to assume that Ukraine is indeed going to negotiate now, given that the one real opportunity for negotiations back in March was thrown away? Well, we'll see. Now, it's not, of course, just the fact that supplies to Ukraine are probably beginning to run out. We're in a very difficult situation in Europe. Today in Britain, today Thursday in Britain, the British government, the British Finance Minister, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is due to outline his mini-budget, his financial statement. There's universal expectations that it will involve significant cuts in public spending and very heavy tax increases. This on top of a cost of living crisis caused by surging inflation. But the British government has in my opinion, no real choice but to go down this road. If it were to continue with spending, if it were to allow the budget hole to continue to grow beyond the £70 billion it currently is, there would be very serious risks with the financial stability of the economy and with the value of sterling as an internationally traded currency. So Britain has no real choice but to go down this route. And I've been getting reports that in Germany also things are looking bad. The German government is apparently already again planning for blackouts. It's planning for food shortages. It's planning for possible protests. Don't know that any of this is going to happen, but the very fact that they're planning for these possibilities is suggestive and concerning in itself. Now, you would have thought, in light of the current situation, that the governments of all of these countries, Britain, Germany, would be trying to look for some way out. And it seems to me that their leaders, Rishi Sunak, perhaps even Olaf Scholz, though I suspect in the case of the latter, that's probably a lost cause by now. He's been so weakened, to be straightforward about this, by his own unwillingness to take a clear position, opposing some of the sanctions campaigns that have been insisted upon by members of his own coalition. Anyway, one might have thought that these Western leaders would be working hard with people like General Milley to try to persuade Washington and Kiev to do what must be done and to sit down and negotiate. I don't expect it. I don't believe it. I think the situation, unfortunately, is going to get worse. It's going to get worse for Ukraine. It's going to get worse for the West. Sometime around the new year, I suspect we are going to find ourselves in the West, rather like the gambler at the roulette table who's run out of throws. Well, there we are. That's my view, rather bleak view of the situation as of today. More from me soon. Remember, you can catch us up on Rumble and Locals. I did a very successful live stream on Locals yesterday, on Wednesday, and I do them every Wednesday exclusively on Locals at 1900 hours Eastern Standard Time. And you can also find us on other platforms as well, BitChute, ODYSEE, Telegram, and Rockfin. And remember, you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.